They thought you were simple, a piece on their board, a slow pawn boxed in by design, predictable and breakable. They smiled while handing you a seat they believed you didn't earn, patted your back like they were congratulating a pet for almost learning a trick. But what they didn't know was that you weren't playing their game. You were memorizing every move, every pattern, every smirk, fake nod, closed door meeting, whispered comment, transaction behind curtains. They thought you didn't hear it, but you did. And not only did you hear it, you documented it, filed it, cataloged it like weapons. While they were flashing badges made of ego, you were collecting ammunition made of truth. You walked in quiet, on purpose, not weak, strategic, because silence isn't surrender when you're studying the terrain. While they rushed for the mic, the spotlight, the attention, you pulled back, not to hide, but to calculate. Because what they call power is often just noise in disguise. What they call dominance is usually just desperate validation. And what they call leadership, just loud followers trying to mimic the last man who fooled them. You saw that early, the blueprint of how fools crown each other. And instead of interrupting their circus, you let it perform. They labeled you what they couldn't decode: uninspiring, underwhelming, average. But all that meant was you weren't feeding their need for drama. And that's where they messed up. Because you weren't average. You were invisible by design. And that's more dangerous than anything they've ever seen. Because you weren't interested in applause. You were building leverage, quietly, relentlessly, precisely. They thought they had time. That the leash they placed on you would keep you circling, obedient, waiting for your moment like a beggar. But beggars ask. You never asked. You observed. You let their guard drop. Let their filters fall. Let their egos inflate to the point of blindness. They laughed with wine-stained lips while you quietly mastered the supply chain behind their smiles. Their partnerships, their dirty handshakes, the underbelly of how their empire was truly run. Because every lie eventually becomes paperwork, and every con eventually has a trail. You followed it while they were busy celebrating illusions, and then the shift began. They didn't see it. Of course they didn't. You don't notice the floor weakening when you're too busy dancing on it, but you knew. You knew exactly which bolt to loosen, which rumor to spread, which truth to leak. You knew who to push, who to expose, and who to keep as a pawn in reverse. They called you forgettable. Now you're unforgettable. They called you unqualified. Now they double-check every move, hoping you don't notice their panic. And they will never say it out loud, but you see it in their behavior, the switch, the guarded tone, the hesitation in their eyes. Because when the tables turn this hard, no one claps. They brace. You didn't just flip the power dynamic. You erased the old one. What they ran from is now begging for your approval. What they laughed at is now their only map out. And what they tried to bury now writes the rules. That's what happens when you play the long game with short-sighted people. They spend years misjudging your silence only to realize it was the sound of them being recorded, documented, studied, prepped for dismantling. Now the same mouths that called you irrelevant are searching for your patterns, your history, your origin. But here's the truth, they'll never find it, because what you are wasn't built in plain sight. You were constructed in shadows, behind walls they never bothered to check. You weren't born from their approval. You were born from their arrogance, from the moments they dismissed you, from the handshakes they offered you without meaning it, from the jokes behind your back, thinking you'd never hear them. Every false nod, every fake praise, every sabotaged opportunity. You took all of it and built your weapon, not made of revenge, but made of undeniable leverage. You let them climb the ladder faster, and when they reached the top, you simply removed the structure beneath them. Now they're falling. And the crash, it's not theatrical, it's surgical, quiet, brutal. The kind of collapse that doesn't scream, it whispers. And those whispers are louder than any applause you could ever want. Because you didn't come to be seen. You came to undo everything they built off the backs of people like you. And now that your name is echoing behind rooms they once owned, the panic has started. Not in words, in actions. The rearranged meetings, the sudden damage control, the calls that go unanswered, the audits, the backtracking, the desperate attempts to rewrite a history you already printed. They were so obsessed with outshining you. They forgot to ask if you even wanted the same spotlight. You didn't. You wanted the controls, the wires, the levers behind their pride. And now that you have them, now that you are the infrastructure, they can't operate without your permission. And the worst part for them isn't losing power. It's realizing the one they mocked had it all along. That every time they underestimated you, you were making them predictable. Every time they baited you, you were analyzing their rhythm. Every time they smiled in your face, you were tracking their fear. Because power doesn't need a stage. It just needs patience. And patience is the one resource they never had. You never needed to expose them loudly. You just needed to make sure they couldn't hide. And now, that's exactly where they are. Nowhere to run, nowhere to spin the story. The collapse is documented. Their faces are frozen, not from shock, but from realization that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't luck. This was a checkmate, played so quietly they thought they were still winning halfway through. But by then, the damage was already done, and the only thing left to do is finish the dismantling you began in silence. Because the moment they catch their breath is the moment you remind them. The real game never had their rules to begin with. It only used their stage, borrowed their spotlight just long enough to blind them with it. While they basked in that fragile glow, you were rearranging everything they never thought to question, not for revenge, not for claps, but because you saw what they refused to admit. The cracks in their confidence weren't accidents, they were patterns, and patterns, once tracked, can be shattered. They mistook your stillness for confusion. They thought silence meant indecision. But you were watching, framing, tracking the echoes of their every move like blueprints for collapse. While they raced for relevance, you moved with accuracy. While they shouted their credentials, you calibrated your entry. And now, you don't knock on doors, you design the floor they stand on. They look at you different now, not with superiority, with surveillance, as if they're trying to detect what they no longer understand, because they don't get to predict you anymore. You're past the range of their assumptions. You're not reactive, you're calculating. They can't control your temperature, your tempo, your triggers. That's what makes you terrifying. You don't respond like they planned. You never did. They just never noticed until it was too late. They used to run the airwaves, but now, even their voice sounds forced. The loud ones fumble. The clever ones delay. The confident ones check for backup. Because your presence isn't noise, it's gravity. It bends behavior before words even form. It's not that they fear what you'll say. They fear that you've already said enough without speaking. And that unspoken weight, it's breaking them in real time. They thought they had power. But what they really had was positioning, temporary, performative, dependent on people believing their narrative. But now the narrative has fractures. The eyes that once followed them blindly now drift. Because power that must be explained isn't real. But your silence speaks with volume. It changes posture. It makes even the arrogant hesitate. They don't walk with the same stride anymore. The ones who mocked you now move with pause. The ones who tried to bury you now whisper your name like a warning. Not because you retaliated, but because you didn't need to. Because every space you touch loses oxygen for anyone who's lied too long. You aren't exposure, you're evolution, and the ones who can't adapt are suffocating in the presence of someone who finally played the long game correctly. You didn't rise by accident. You weren't handed the moment. You earned it with consistency, discipline, and refusal. Refusal to bend where others begged. Refusal to shrink when the room got colder. Refusal to flinch when they pushed. And now, that refusal has become the standard. You didn't just outperform them. You outlasted the lies they built their empire on. And those lies are beginning to rot from the inside. You don't make moves now. You cause reactions. You don't initiate chaos. You highlight the truth and let them fall apart, trying to hide it. And they are falling silently, desperately. Behind the scenes, the same people who once celebrated without you now strategize around you. Their every campaign, speech, pivot, it all leads back to a quiet obsession with your next move. They don't acknowledge it publicly, but behind every meeting, your name sits in the center of the table. Because you didn't just disrupt their comfort. You redefined the measurement of value. You made credentials look hollow. You made influence look outdated. They followed algorithms. You followed instinct. And instinct, once proven right enough times, becomes the only thing anyone trusts. Now they mimic you. They borrow your structure. They regurgitate your rhythm and try to pass it off as foresight. But it's not foresight. It's reaction. They've become spectators in their own empire. You walk through it not as a visitor, but as a reminder. That power isn't in volume, it's in consequence. That legacy isn't in visibility, it's in undeniability. And you're undeniable now. Not because you pushed yourself in front, but because everything else got too fragile to hold weight. And when it all collapsed, you were the only one still standing. Now their networks fracture, their alliances stall, the chain of control they used to rely on. Disconnected, you didn't cut the wires. You made the current pass through you, slowly, silently, and without permission. Until even their most trusted connections started drifting your way. Not out of fear, out of alignment. Because alignment doesn't beg for attention. It pulls it without asking. You became a variable they didn't prepare for. You weren't loud enough to be seen as a threat. But you were stable enough to become necessary. And necessity changes everything. It shifts conversations. It rearranges the structure of who gets consulted and who gets left out. It puts the spotlight on those who don't want it and burns out those who lived for it. They still act like they hold ground, still put on the performance, but now even their smiles look choreographed. Even their confidence feels like crisis management. You didn't take their throne. You erased the relevance of having one. Because power isn't about the chair. It's about the people willing to follow you, even when no one's watching. And people are watching. Closer than ever, not because you demanded it, but because the ripple of your work has become too consistent to ignore. You don't scream proof. You walk it. You don't announce plans. You complete them. And the gap between what they promise and what you deliver is where their world is now collapsing. You didn't ask to lead. You just refused to be led by the blind. And that refusal became a beacon, a signal to everyone else who was watching quietly, waiting for someone to prove that integrity still meant something, that timing still mattered, that composure wasn't weakness, it was leverage. You used their tactics against them without copying them. You didn't outshout them, you outlasted the chaos. And now, the calm you move with. It's not peace, it's dominance. The kind that doesn't require validation. The kind that makes enemies paranoid and allies alert. The kind that lets you walk in rooms you weren't invited to and change the entire tone without saying a single word. Because what they thought was over was just the beginning. They thought they survived your silence. But your silence was never the end game. It was the build-up. And now they realize something worse than being confronted. They realize they were never in control to begin with. Because the outcome wasn't shifted, it was engineered. Engineered to show you the difference between influence and impact, between popularity and permanence. And the more they scramble, the clearer it becomes. They weren't outplayed, they were out-timed, out-thought, outpaced by someone they swore would never matter. Now every plan they roll out has your fingerprint on its failure. Every structure they relied on feels compromised, not because you sabotaged it, but because you no longer fit inside their equation. And when something doesn't fit, it breaks the entire formula. They tried to write you out. Now the story doesn't move unless you write it. They thought they were irreplaceable. Now they scroll through your wins, trying to replicate the pieces. But they'll never get it right. Because what you built wasn't an act. It was a system of deliberate misalignment, with every rule they crafted to protect their comfort. You didn't crash their world. You just ended the illusion that it was ever unshakable. And when the dust clears, and they look around trying to piece together what went wrong, they'll keep finding your shadow behind every consequence. Not as a ghost, but as the architect of their collapse. Because you weren't the storm, you were the pivot point. The hidden rotation that shifted everything they thought was immovable. And their next breath is about to do exactly that. Not to recalibrate, not to fight back, but to feel the exact moment their script collapsed under the weight of reality. Because they just realized they've been participating in a story they didn't write. On a board you've been flipping from underneath their feet since the beginning. This isn't aftermath. This is aftermath wearing a new face, one they can't recognize, can't imitate, and can't control. You didn't come to speak louder, you came to rewire the room. And now the room moves differently. It speaks in lower tones. It hesitates more. It scans for you before it makes decisions. Because your presence isn't just noticed, it's factored in. That's what they didn't anticipate. You weren't part of their algorithm. You weren't supposed to rise. Not without sponsors, not without gatekeepers, not without validation from those they bowed to. But here you are. And the worst part for them? You didn't just rise. You made rising look effortless. They've built identities out of grind and effort, out of proving and posturing. But you moved without noise. You evolved without notice. You grew without needing permission, and now they scramble. Because proximity to you no longer offers opportunity. It offers exposure. And for people who built their relevance on illusions, exposure is death. They aren't hiding from you. They're hiding from the version of themselves they become in your presence. Because next to you they shrink. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. You didn't just enter their arena. You made the crowd realize the arena wasn't real, that the fighters were staged, that the blood was fake. And the trophies? Pre-selected. But your victories? No applause needed, no spotlight necessary. Because the moment they saw you move, without asking, without flinching, without adjusting to them, the applause turned inward. They started clapping for the wrong side, their own doubt. You didn't destroy their story. You rewrote the ending, and worse. You made sure they'd have to live in it. They wore masks. You became the mirror. And now, the reflection haunts them, not because of what you took, but because of what you revealed. Their influence wasn't built to last. Their clout couldn't translate outside their echo chamber. Their voice never had weight, only volume. And volume doesn't survive a reality check. You didn't give them silence. You gave them clarity. Now their old tactics don't land. Their shock value doesn't shock. Their punchlines don't connect. Because you changed what connects. You changed what the crowd sees as real. And once real has been seen, theatrical doesn't sell. You broke them without touching them. Because all they ever had was appearance. And you brought presence. Presence built on history, on consistency, on momentum they can't borrow. And now they face the truth. You weren't the one lagging behind. You were the only one running a real race. They never saw the shift happen. Because you didn't broadcast it. You just kept building quietly, consistently, brutally. While they celebrated quick wins, you secured ground. While they chased virality, you built legacy. While they screamed into algorithms, you rewired the conversation, and now they're frozen, not from fear, but from realization. They see that the room doesn't move until you do, that decisions pause until you react, that narratives die unless you feed them. You didn't steal their spotlight, you made it follow you. You didn't become the standard. You revealed there never was one until you walked in. And now, every metric they trust has turned against them. Because followers can't follow someone who's being followed. Because numbers don't mean weight if the weight isn't respected. And respect can't be purchased. It has to be earned. You earned it the hard way. Not through platforms, through proof. And proof always speaks loudest in the silence after the hype dies. They were addicted to first impressions. You mastered final outcomes. They were designed to trend. You were forged to endure. And when endurance walks into a room built on temporary relevance, panic follows. Quiet, subtle, strategic panic. Now they second-guess their moves. Not because they're wrong, but because you exist. And your existence dismantles everything they once called power. Because power that flinches in the presence of truth was never power at all. You weren't here to threaten them. You were here to replace them, not by force, by function. Because when a function becomes outdated, it doesn't matter how loud it screams. It gets archived. And they feel it. In the way people talk now. In the words no longer spoken around them. In the way their compliments land with less certainty. Because behind every nod, every handshake, every subtle glance is your shadow. They're no longer trusted as leaders. They're measured as relics. And relics don't move culture forward. They collect dust while the future walks past them. And you didn't walk past. You walked through. Every one of their institutions, every one of their assumptions, every one of their hollow strategies, You walked through and left fingerprints they can't erase. They tried to respond. But responses don't work when the blueprint has been redrawn. And the blueprint now is yours. You don't need credit. You have proof. You don't need followers. You have traction. You don't need to explain. You are the explanation. And now they spend their days trying to mimic the rhythm of someone who doesn't even march. You didn't create a lane. You made the highway irrelevant. And that's why they hate you. Because people now skip their step just to wait for your next move. Their influence used to echo. Now it ricochets off your presence. No aim, no hit, no impact. Because when you walk with intention, everything built on performance feels small. And small doesn't survive scrutiny. Their biggest mistake? Thinking you were coming to compete. But you weren't watching their throne. You were building a new kingdom, one they can't enter. Because the gate doesn't respond to volume. It only opens to authenticity. You weren't the storm. You were the proof the storm never mattered. And when history asks, what happened? No need to speak. Just point to the moment the crowd stopped clapping for them and started waiting for you. Because you didn't just walk in. You walked in with receipts. And those receipts? They're written in collapsed faces, broken momentum, forgotten hype, and timelines that now only orbit your movement. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't revolution. It was replacement. And you were never loud about it, because you never had to be. You just kept showing up with facts. And the facts, they made the lies obsolete. So when the next group tries to rise off illusion, they'll check to see if you're still watching. Because if you are, they won't even begin. You're not just ahead. You're the reason the rest now lag. You're not just a name. You're the reason names tremble. You're not just in the room. You're the one who redefined its gravity. Let them collapse. Let them spin. Let them post. Let them panic. Because you played them all. And now you walk on the shards of the throne they thought you wanted.